Wild horse seen among wolves. What the hunter discovered will leave you shocked. The cold was biting that morning in Wyoming, and the silence of the forest was so deep that Jake Harper could hear the sound of his own breath echoing in the vast, frozen landscape. As he walked down the snow-covered trail, rifle on his shoulder and eyes alert, something unusual caught his attention. Just a few yards away, in a clearing almost hidden among the pines, an incredible scene unfolded before him. A group of large, powerful wolves circled around a black Mustang horse. The contrast between the strength of the predators and the horse's almost supernatural calm made Jake freeze in place, his heart pounding in his chest. It didn't make sense. He quickly crouched down, hiding behind a fallen log, unable to tear his eyes away from the scene. The horse didn't seem frightened. On the contrary, it stood firm, motionless like a statue, while the wolves observed it closely. One of the wolves, larger than the others, slowly advanced, getting closer to the Mustang. Jake held his breath, expecting an attack at any moment. But what happened next left him in shock. The wolf tilted its head slightly, as if recognizing the horse. There was no aggression. It was as if some kind of silent pact existed between them. The hunter felt a shiver run down his spine. This defied everything he knew about the wild. Jake adjusted the camera he always carried to document his hunts. He knew no one would believe him unless he recorded that moment. When the zoom focused on the horse, he noticed something even more disturbing. The Mustang was covered in deep scars, marks from battles that seemed ancient. Its dark eyes, fixed on the lead wolf, showed no fear, but a chilling intelligence, almost human. Jake began to question what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a horse among wolves. It was something far more mysterious, something that seemed to carry an ancient story buried deep in the forest. Suddenly, a dry twig snapped under Jake's foot, and the sound echoed like thunder in the quiet clearing. In an instant, all the wolves turned their heads toward him, their eyes glowing with a deadly intensity. Jake froze. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. Then, the horse lifted its head and looked directly at him. There was something in that gaze, a mixture of challenge and understanding, as if the Mustang knew exactly who he was and why he was there. Jake felt the weight of something unexplainable, as if he were being judged by forces he couldn't comprehend. For reasons he didn't understand, Jake decided to follow the horse and the pack as they moved deeper into the dense forest. The cold wind whispered through the trees, and the hunter felt he was crossing the line between what he knew and the unknown. Each step seemed like a challenge to the very balance of nature. But something was pulling him, a need to understand that mystery. What Jake would discover by following those tracks would change everything. Not just his life, but the way he saw the world. Jake followed the tracks in the snow cautiously, his heart pounding against his chest. The clearing where he had spotted the horse and the wolves now seemed far away, but the mystery that scene carried urged him to move forward. Each footprint left by the Mustang in the snow was clear, accompanied by the marks of the wolves' paws. The silence of the forest was interrupted only by the sound of the wind and the occasional rustling of snow-covered branches. Jake felt as if he was entering forbidden territory, a place where nature held secrets not meant to be uncovered. As he moved on, he noticed something strange. The horse's tracks were firm and regular, but the wolves' marks seemed to change. At first, they were deep, indicating a walking pace, but at certain points, they disappeared entirely, as if the animals had simply vanished. Jake stopped, his rifle now steady in his hands, and looked around. Nothing made sense. He checked his GPS, but the device seemed to be malfunctioning, the screen flickering with inexplicable interference. The discomfort grew in his chest, but he couldn't stop. Something was calling him, something beyond his understanding. Shortly after, he reached a new clearing. But this time, the scene was even stranger. In the center, the Mustang was standing still again, its imposing body standing out against the white snow. Around it, only 3 wolves remained, sitting like silent guardians. Jake quickly counted the tracks and realized that at least 2 wolves had vanished. He tried to find any sign of a struggle or escape, but there was nothing. It was as if they had never been there. The Mustang slowly turned its head, its eyes locked on Jake once more. There was something unsettling in that gaze, as if the horse was daring him to approach. In that gaze, it was as if the horse was challenging him to come closer. Against his own instincts, Jake took a few steps forward. The wind grew stronger, cutting across his face like a blade of ice. He stopped just a few meters from the horse, which now seemed larger than any mustang he had ever seen. Its scars were even more visible up close, and Jake noticed something peculiar. Some of them had shapes that seemed deliberate, like marks made by human hands. He reached out to touch the animal, but before he could take another step, the horse let out a loud, deafening neigh. The sound echoed through the forest, carrying a force that made Jake step back and fall to his knees in the snow. Before he could regain his composure, the mustang suddenly turned and galloped into the dense forest, followed by the remaining wolves. Jake stood there, breathless, with his mind in turmoil. Something about that neigh seemed to have awakened a memory, a distant echo he couldn't decipher. He knew he should go back home, but his curiosity was stronger than his fear. He stood up, brushed the snow off his clothes, and followed the tracks once again, unaware that he was about to discover something that would forever change everything he believed about the connection between man and nature. Jake continued to move through the forest, his steps growing more cautious as the terrain became trickier. The snow deepened, making each movement harder, and the sound of the wind whistled through the trees like a warning whisper. The tracks of the horse and the wolves were still visible, but they seemed to follow a more erratic pattern, as if the group had begun to deliberately change direction. Jake felt like an intruder in unfamiliar territory, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He had to know. He needed to understand why that scarred horse was there, and what connected it to that pack of wolves. The forest seemed denser now, as if the very pines were trying to block his way. Jake passed through an area where the trees were so tall and ancient that their branches created a kind of natural cathedral, blocking almost all the light. Everything was silent, eerily silent. He paused for a moment and noticed something strange. There were no more paw prints. Only the horse's tracks remained ahead of him, solitary and almost perfect in the snow. Jake frowned. Where are the wolves? He quickly turned around, scanning the area, but there was no sign of the creatures. A feeling of isolation washed over him. He was alone, or at least that's how it seemed. When he finally emerged from the oppressive darkness, he found himself in front of a small valley. In the center, there was an abandoned cabin, old and worn by time. Its windows were broken, and the roof was almost collapsing under the weight of the snow. Jake hadn't expected to find signs of civilization so far off the trail, and his mind began working frantically. Who could have lived here? And why did this place feel so wrong? He approached slowly, his rifle now gripped firmly. The silence around the cabin was unsettling, as if the world had stopped breathing. He felt that ominous sense again, the same feeling he had when he first spotted the horse. As he got closer, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. Painted on the weathered wood of the cabin were marks that resembled the scars on the horse. Thick, irregular lines crossed each other, forming patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like symbols. He reached out to touch the marks, but hesitated. Something made him pull back, as if his body knew this was no ordinary place. Then, from inside the cabin, a low, constant sound began to echo. It wasn't a growl, nor the sound of the wind. It was something deeper, a kind of vibration that he felt more than heard. His curiosity now mixed with growing fear. What's inside this cabin? Jake approached the door, which was only slightly ajar. He tried to peer through the gap, but the darkness inside was impenetrable. His hands were sweating despite the cold, and he realized he was holding the rifle so tightly that his fingers ached. With a slow push, he opened the door, which creaked like an agonizing scream. In that instant, the deep sound coming from inside stopped completely, plunging the place into an even more oppressive silence. When he finally stepped inside, Jake's eyes took time to adjust to the darkness. But what he saw inside, something that seemed impossible, made him take a step back, his heart racing like never before. Jake stood still at the entrance of the cabin, his body frozen, as if the cold had finally managed to freeze him. Inside the small space, lit only by the faint light streaming through the broken windows, he saw the impossible. On the floor, in the center of the cabin, there was a series of bones carefully arranged in a circular pattern. The bones weren't just from animals, there were human bones among them. Some were clean, white like the snow outside, while others still bore dark stains from time. Jake swallowed hard, the rifle trembling in his hands. He felt like he had entered a place that didn't belong to him, a place holding secrets too ancient to be understood. In the center of the circle, something even more disturbing caught his attention. A torn, dirty piece of fabric, ragged and shredded, yet it seemed to belong to an old saddle. He approached cautiously, each step echoing on the rotting wooden floor. When he knelt to take a closer look, he noticed the fabric had the same pattern as the scars on the horse's body. The marks were identical, as if they were a signature. "What are you?" Jake murmured to himself, his voice barely escaping. It was impossible not to feel that this was somehow connected to the Mustang. The horse wasn't just a wild creature. It was a survivor, but from what? While inspecting the circle of bones, a sound from outside made Jake jump to his feet. It was the whinny of a horse, long, deep, and full of intensity that made his skin crawl. He ran to the cabin door and looked out over the valley, but the Mustang was no longer there. However, the marks of its hooves were fresh in the snow, as if it had just passed through. Jake felt something strange in the air, a nearly imperceptible shift, as if time had moved for a moment. He looked around, searching for the wolves, but they were gone too. Everything was silent again, but it wasn't a natural silence. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. Jake spun around quickly, rifle aimed at the darkness of the cabin. But there was no one there. The circle of bones remained undisturbed, and the piece of cloth still lay motionless in the center. His heart raced, and for a moment he felt as though he was being watched. There was something in the cabin that he couldn't see, but it was there, present, pulsing in the dense, cold air. He tried to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks, but the feeling wouldn't leave him. He took a few steps back, keeping his eyes on the darkness, until his foot touched something on the ground. Jake crouched down and picked up what seemed to be a rusty piece of metal, covered by the snow that had piled up near the entrance. When he cleared the piece with his hands, he saw that it was an old horseshoe, heavy and marked with strange symbols similar to the scars on the horse. He shuddered, the sensation of holding something he shouldn't. "Are you trying to show me something?" he whispered, almost as if speaking to the horse. Without thinking twice, he slipped the horseshoe into his backpack, zipped it up with trembling hands, and turned to leave. But as he began to move away from the cabin, something made him stop. A shadow moved in the distance, and he knew exactly who it was. The horse was waiting for him, and it wanted him to follow. Jake felt the air grow even colder as he watched the silhouette of the horse in the distance, standing at the line where the valley met the forest. The Mustang was motionless, but its presence was almost magnetic, as if it were demanding that Jake follow. Every fiber of his being told him to step back, to abandon the mystery before it was too late. But the horseshoe in his backpack weighed more than it should, like a reminder that he was already involved in something he couldn't just ignore. Taking a deep breath, he began walking toward the horse, each step slow and filled with hesitation. As he moved forward, the Mustang turned around and disappeared into the trees, leaving only the marks of its hooves in the snow. Jake quickened his pace, adrenaline rushing through his veins. The forest seemed denser than ever, and the silence was so complete that he could hear the muffled sound of his own footsteps. The hoofprints led him down a trail he'd never seen before, a path that wound through the pines and descended toward an area that seemed darker, almost untouched by the sun. Each step seemed to pull Jake further into the unknown, and he began to wonder if he'd be able to find his way back. Finally, he reached a narrow gorge, where the stone walls seemed to rise endlessly toward the sky. In the center of the passage, the Mustang stood again, its imposing body blocking the way. Jake stopped, breathless, staring at the animal. It was the first time he had seen it so close, and the scars on the horse's body seemed even more striking. Some were almost geometric in shape, while others looked deep and brutal, as though they had been made with purpose. Jake tried to approach slowly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "What do you want from me?" he asked softly, his own voice echoing off the walls of the gorge. The horse took a step to the side, revealing something Jake hadn't noticed before. There was an opening in the canyon wall, a narrow entrance that seemed to lead to a hidden cave. The darkness emanating from it was almost palpable, as if it were alive. Jake felt his heart race again. He knew this was the next step, but everything in his mind screamed that going in there would be dangerous. Still, something inside him insisted that he couldn't stop now. He looked at the horse one last time, hoping for some kind of sign, but the Mustang simply stared back at him with those deep, enigmatic eyes, as if testing his courage. With the lantern in hand, Jake took a deep breath and entered the cave. The air inside was colder than he expected, and the damp, earthy smell seemed suffocating. The walls were covered with marks that resembled the horse's scars and the symbols on the horseshoe, etched as if someone had carved them with precision long ago. Each step Jake took echoed in the narrow tunnel, amplifying the feeling that he was not alone. When the light from his lantern illuminated a large open chamber, he suddenly stopped. In the center of the cave, something faintly glowed in the darkness. It was a strange, metallic object, covered in the same marks he had started to recognize. He knew he had reached the heart of the mystery, but he also felt that he was about to cross a line with no return. Jake moved deeper into the cave with slow, cautious steps, every sound of his boots echoing as if the cave itself was breathing. The light from his lantern flickered on the damp walls, revealing more of the strange symbols that now seemed to be repeating with increasing frequency. He tried to ignore the cold that seemed to penetrate to his bones, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. In the center of the chamber, the metallic glow became stronger, as if it was pulsing with a life of its own. Jake took a deep breath, forcing himself to continue, even as his mind fought against the rising fear that overwhelmed him. When he finally got closer, he saw what was causing the glow. It was an ancient piece of metal, partially buried in the rock floor of the cave. The piece was shaped like an irregular circle, and the same symbols he had found on the horseshoe and the horse's scars were engraved there, but with an almost supernatural precision. Jake knelt beside the object, his breath uneven, and reached out to touch it. As soon as his fingers brushed the cold surface, he felt a shock pass through his body, as if he had just been struck by lightning. He recoiled, gasping, but the metal's glow now seemed brighter, almost blinding. Suddenly, a deep, resonating sound filled the cave, like the horse's neigh, but mixed with something else, something Jake couldn't identify. It was a vibration that seemed to resonate directly within him, as if it wasn't just a sound but a call. He spun around, his lantern shaking in his hands, and saw the Mustang standing at the entrance of the chamber. The horse stared at him with the same intensity as before, but this time, there was something else in its gaze, a sense of urgency, as if it were trying to convey a message Jake couldn't understand. Jake felt like he was on the edge of something bigger than he could understand. The shining metal, the horse, the symbols carved into the walls, everything seemed connected, like pieces of an ancient puzzle he had stumbled upon by accident. He stood up, his mind spinning with questions. But before he could decide what to do, the cave shook slightly, a vibration that made the dust fall from the ceiling. The Mustang turned sharply and whinnied, disappearing into the darkness of the entrance. Jake knew this was his only chance. Grabbing the metal object with both hands, he ran after the horse, feeling that the next step of the mystery was about to unfold, and it would require more courage than he could imagine. Jake rushed out of the cave, the metal object pressed tightly against his chest as his heart raced uncontrollably. The cold night air hit him like a blow, and for a moment he had to stop to catch his breath. Outside, the world seemed quieter than before, as if everything were waiting for the outcome of something inevitable. The Mustang stood a few yards away, bathed in the pale moonlight that now filtered through the bare trees. It neighed again, a deep and almost threatening sound, before turning and slowly walking toward a trail Jake hadn't noticed. Without thinking, he followed, as if being guided to a destination he could not avoid. As they walked, Jake couldn't take his eyes off the metal object in his hands. Now that he was outside, he noticed the glow had dimmed, but the symbols etched into the surface seemed to radiate a subtle warmth, almost like a pulse. He sensed that this wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a key, or perhaps part of something larger. The horse seemed to know exactly where it was going, moving with a determination that only strengthened Jake's belief that it wasn't just an ordinary animal. Jake began to wonder if the Mustang was truly a regular creature or something much older, something connected to those symbols and that isolated place in the world. The trail led to a clearing Jake had never seen before, even after years of exploring that forest. In the center, there was a peculiar structure, a circle of large, weathered stones arranged with precise alignment. The stones were covered with the same symbols he recognized, and in the center of the circle, there was a small cavity, perfectly shaped, as if waiting for something. Jake stopped at the edge of the clearing, his eyes shifting between the horse and the structure. He knew instinctively what he had to do. His hands trembled as he lifted the metallic object and walked toward the cavity in the center of the circle. When he placed the object into the cavity, a deep sound reverberated through the air, like distant thunder. The structure began to glow with a soft, pulsing light, and the ground beneath Jake vibrated slightly. The Mustang let out a loud neigh but remained still. Instead, it lifted its head, as if waiting for something. Jake stepped back, watching as the light from the stones grew brighter, forming a pattern that seemed to spread across the snow around them. Deep down, he knew that what was happening wasn't just a coincidence. This was the climax of something ancient and powerful, something the horse had somehow chosen for him to unravel. And then, in the absolute silence, the light vanished, leaving Jake staring into the emptiness, sensing that the true mystery was about to be revealed. Jake stood still at the center of the stone circle, the sound of thunder still echoing in his mind. The majestic Mustang stared at him as though waiting for his next move. The light that had filled the clearing had completely disappeared, but something in the air felt different. It was as if time had stopped, and the forest around him was held in an expectant silence. Jake looked at the metallic object now lodged in the cavity, its edges perfectly aligned with the marks in the stone. He felt he was on the brink of something immense, but the sensation was as overwhelming as it was unsettling. Suddenly, a low, constant sound emerged from the ground, reverberating beneath his feet. Jake looked around, trying to locate the source, but soon realized it was coming from the stones themselves. It was a rhythmic vibration, almost like a heartbeat. He knelt to inspect the base of the circle and noticed the marks starting to glow again, this time with a golden hue, more intense than before. The Mustang stepped forward, tilting its head slightly as if urging him to continue. "What do you want me to see?" Jake murmured, his voice barely audible. As Jake watched, the ground at the center of the circle began to slowly give way, revealing a narrow opening. He leaped back, his heart racing. The air coming from the opening was warm and dense, carrying an earthy, metallic smell. The horse moved closer, whinnying softly. Jake hesitated, his survival instincts screaming at him to step back. But something stronger was pulling him toward the darkness below. He grabbed his lantern, took a deep breath, and began descending into the opening, his feet steady on the stone steps that appeared as he moved forward. The passage was narrow, but soon it opened up into a wide corridor, illuminated by a soft light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Jake stopped, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Etched into the stone were the same symbols he had seen on the horseshoe, the horse, and in the cave. But now they told a story. Stylized figures showed horses fighting alongside wolves, like inseparable allies. Another scene depicted a circle of men, all with marks similar to the Mustang's scars, gathered around a central horse. Jake touched the marks, feeling the cold of the stone, and realized he was witnessing something ancient, something that connected this horse to a past he could scarcely imagine. Jake walked down the lit corridor, his eyes fixed on the symbols that stretched across the walls, like a narrative carved in time. Each step seemed to echo centuries of history, and the air inside had a tangible weight, as if it carried the secrets of those who had been there before. He noticed that, as he moved forward, the figures on the walls began to change. The once majestic horses now appeared chained, with scars resembling the marks on the mustang. Wolves surrounded the men in the carvings, but this time they seemed to be observers, silent witnesses to something terrible. What happened here? Jake whispered to himself, feeling an increasing sense of urgency. Finally, the corridor opened into a large, circular room with a stone altar at the center. On the altar, a metal sculpture faintly glowed, depicting a horse surrounded by wolves, the same familiar marks engraved on its surface. Jake approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on the object. There was something incredibly detailed about the sculpture, as if every engraving told a part of the story he was beginning to unravel. Next to the altar, he saw something else that made his heart race. A horseshoe identical to the one he had found before, but this one glowed brightly, as if it were alive. Before he could touch the object, a low, deep sound filled the room, like muffled thunder. Jake spun around, pointing his flashlight at the entrance, but saw nothing. The sound continued, a pulse that seemed to echo in his own chest. He looked back at the altar, and the sculpture now seemed to emit a faint, almost imperceptible light. It was then that he realized, this wasn't just a ceremonial room. It was a place of judgment. The presence of the mustang in the forest, the marks on its body, the wolves, everything was connected to this place. Jake felt a pang of fear. What had he uncovered? The sound grew louder, and suddenly, the ground began to vibrate beneath his feet. He staggered backward, trying to keep his balance, as the walls of the room seemed to pulse with the same energy he had felt when touching the metallic object in the cave. The light from the sculpture grew brighter, illuminating the symbols around him, which now seemed to move, dancing on the walls like living shadows. Jake tried to step back, but it felt as though an invisible force was holding him in place. And then, in the midst of the chaos, he heard, not a sound, but a clear and powerful voice in his mind. Choose or go back to where it all began. Jake stood frozen, his eyes locked on the glowing sculpture as the voice continued to echo in his mind. Choose or return to where you began. The message seemed to carry an impossible weight, as if the entire burden of the story was now in his hands. He looked around, his heart racing uncontrollably. The engravings on the walls pulsed with light, as if they were alive, while the altar in the center seemed to beckon him. The horse and the wolves carved into the stone were more than just figures. They were symbols of something ancient, something that transcended any logical explanation. He felt the horseshoe in his backpack vibrate lightly, a silent reminder that his decision was inevitable. Taking a deep breath, Jake walked toward the altar. Every step seemed to require a monumental effort, as if the very air itself was trying to stop him. When he finally stood before the sculpture, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. There was an empty space at the base, perfectly shaped for the horseshoe he carried. He pulled the object from his backpack with trembling hands, feeling the warm pulse it emitted. "If this is what you want," he whispered, placing the horseshoe in the space. The moment he did, the room was flooded with blinding light, and Jake felt an intense heat coursing through his body, as if he were being engulfed by something larger than he could comprehend. When the light dimmed, Jake opened his eyes and saw that the room had changed. The images on the walls were now still, but their shapes had transformed. They showed a scene that seemed to be the conclusion of that ancient story. The horse, the wolves, and the men together, but in harmony, as equals. He felt a strange peace, something that contrasted with the previous chaos. But then, he noticed something even more striking. The mustang was there, at the entrance of the room, its eyes fixed on Jake. The animal seemed more real, more alive than ever, as if it were waiting for the final outcome. Jake took a step toward the horse, feeling that all the mystery had led to this moment. As he got closer, the mustang lifted its head and let out a deep, resonant whinny that echoed through the room like a farewell. In an instant, the animal turned and galloped back down the corridor, disappearing into the darkness. Jake stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. He knew his life would never be the same. Somehow, he had been part of something extraordinary, something that connected humanity to nature in ways he could barely begin to understand. With one last glance at the altar, he turned and made his way toward the exit, feeling that, although the mystery remained, he now carried a part of that story within him.